Imagine a king whose body was literally rotting while he was still alive. Oozing pus, decaying flesh, you could smell him from rooms away. This was a man who made marriage a death sentence and turned the Tower of London into England's most feared address. You've heard the stories. It's the big, bold Henry VIII, always eating, laughing, and swapping wives. But that's the fairy tale version. The real Henry? He was something much darker. A paranoid, decaying tyrant who terrified everyone around him. This guy slept with loaded guns by his bed. He ate like a man possessed. And the way he treated women would make today's worst criminals look tame. By the time his life was nearing the end, Henry VIII wasn't just a sick man. He was a walking horror film, not just by medieval standards, even people back then who were used to plague's wounds and filth were sickened by what he'd become. It all started in 1536. Henry was still young when he took part in a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace, and everything changed. He was knocked off his horse and lay unconscious for over 2 hours. Back then, that basically meant you were dead. He eventually came to, but those close to him noticed something was off. Henry wasn't the same. His mood, his judgment, it all shifted. The once charming king became angry, violent, and paranoid. But what happened to his mind was only half the horror. Physically, Henry was deteriorating fast. That same accident left him with leg injuries that never properly healed. Those wounds turned into massive ulcers. Open, festering sores that constantly oozed pus and blood and the smell of rotting flesh. These weren't little scabs. These were gaping, infected holes eating through his lower body day by day. People could smell him from down the hall. Literally, some courtiers would gag before they even entered the room. Servants had to hold perfumed cloths to their faces when attending to him. Some actually vomited from the smell alone. Even his royal doctorsmen, who risked execution if they refused, the king started avoiding him. They made excuses just to not see his legs. And then there was his size. By the end of his life, Henry weighed around 400 pounds. His waist alone measured 54 inches. To give you an idea, that's bigger than most people are tall. His face swelled up so much, his eyes looked like tiny slits buried in his fat. His neck disappeared entirely. He looked like a giant sweaty balloon was sitting on his shoulders. He couldn't move on his own anymore. Chairs had to be custom built with wheels and pulleys so teams of servants could roll him from room to room, and as they moved him, parts of his infected legs would literally fall off. Bits of royal flesh just dropping onto the floor. Servants had to follow behind him with cloths and buckets, picking up pieces of their decomposing king. Can you even imagine that being your job? Cleaning up chunks of Henry VIII like some kind of gruesome royal janitor? Many of them couldn't take it. They actually quit. And quitting on the king wasn't a small thing. The court, once seen as the heart of English power, had turned into a place of dread. Being called into the king's presence felt like a punishment. He looked terrifying. He smelled even worse, and his behavior was completely unpredictable. And sadly, that brain injury from the joust didn't just affect his legs. It shattered his mind too. Before, Henry had at least been able to pretend to be kind. He wrote poems, composed music, sent sweet letters. After the accident, it was cold, cruel, and loved watching people suffer. He ordered deaths over the smallest slights. And sometimes, he made people watch their loved ones die before he killed them too. Modern doctors believe he had a mix of health conditions in his final years, and none of them were easy to live with. He had infected ulcers. He was morbidly obese. But he also likely had Cushing syndrome, which causes extreme mood swings and slow-healing wounds. On top of that, he may have developed diabetes, which made those leg infections even worse. Here's the tragic twist. This man who claimed to rule by divine right could barely control his own body anymore. He had to be followed around with portable toilets because he couldn't make it to the bathroom on time. This was the same king who killed people for not bowing low enough. No, he couldn't even stay clean. Most people remember the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But that little chant doesn't come close to describing the nightmare his wives lived through. Henry didn't just kill them. He broke them down piece by piece mentally and emotionally before swinging the axe. Take Catherine of Aragon, his first wife. She endured the longest psychological torture of all. She wasn't just divorced, she was publicly shamed, locked away, and cut off from her daughter. When Henry wanted to marry Anne Boleyn, he didn't just ask Catherine to step aside. He said their 24-year marriage had never been real. He basically called her an imposter who had sinned for 2 decades straight. But it got even crueler. Henry banned her from seeing their daughter Mary. He used their child as a weapon. Imagine that. Being told you can't even see your own child because your husband decided your life together didn't count. Catherine spent her final years. She was basically under house arrest ban from using her royal title. It's cut off from loved ones. And always living under the threat of execution if she didn't go along with it. Henry's version of the truth. Henry didn't just exile Catherine. He played mind games with her. One day, he'd send her warm messages and gifts. The next, he'd threaten to charge her with treason. He forced her to sign papers saying their marriage had never been real, then changed his mind and demanded different papers. Over and over, he kept her guessing. The constant emotional whiplash took a toll. Catherine's health collapsed. She developed severe stomach problems, which many believe were from stress or maybe even poison. By the time she died in 1536, she was completely alone. Just a few loyal servants stood by her side. Henry didn't attend her funeral and refused to let their daughter Mary say goodbye. She wrote him final letters pleading for mercy for their daughter, saying she still loved him after all those years. He never responded, didn't even acknowledge her death. Anne Boleyn's end was even more horrifying. Henry didn't just want her gone. He built a whole nightmare around her downfall, dragging it out to break her mind before her body. It started with her musician, Mark Smeaton. Henry had him tortured until he confessed to sleeping with the Queen. But that wasn't enough. He wanted more. He had 4 more men arrested, including Anne's own brother, George, and forced confessions. Out of them too? Imagine the horror Anne must have felt watching it unfold. She saw innocent people close to her arrested, accused, and destroyed just for knowing her. It was psychological torment on a terrifying scale. But Henry wasn't done. He made Anne watch. One by one, the men were executed, including her brother. She stood there knowing she'd be next. When her brother's head was raised to the crowd, it wasn't just a message to the kingdom. It was meant to crush Anne's spirit completely. Even her own execution was turned into a slow mental punishment. At first, Henry sentenced her to be burned alive, the traditional punishment for adultery. Then, he changed his mind and ordered a beheading. But not right away. He brought in a French swordsman for the job, which meant a delay. So Anne had to sit in the Tower of London for days, waiting for the man who would end her life to arrive. It gave her time to unravel. In her final days, witnesses said she bounced between wild laughter and deep prayer, hours of silence, then sudden hysterics. Her mind was breaking, watching 5 men die, knowing she'd be next, knowing the charges were all lies. No. It was more than most people could take, and she was completely alone. Then came Catherine Howard, and her story might be the most chilling of all, because she was barely more than a teenager when she married Henry. She was maybe 19 or 20. He was nearly 50, massively overweight, with rotting legs and a terrifying temper. That marriage alone was traumatic. When Henry learned that Catherine had past sexual relationships, he snapped. His reaction showed just how far his cruelty could go. He didn't just have her executed. He passed a new law making it treason to marry the king without revealing every detail of your sexual past. Think about that. He rewrote the law of the land because he felt embarrassed that his teenage wife hadn't been a virgin. Then he had her locked in the Tower of London for months. And during that time, he played the same sick mind games he used on others. One day, he'd send word that she might be spared if she confessed. Next, he'd describe exactly how her execution would happen. The emotional torture was so intense that Catherine broke down. Guards reported that she would scream so loudly it echoed through the tower. Other times, she went totally silent, like her mind had just shut off. By the time her execution came, she didn't look like a teenager anymore. Witnesses said she looked like someone who had aged years in just a few months. The fear had physically changed her. Then there was Jane Seymour. She's often called the lucky one because she died of natural causes, but even her story reveals Henry's coldness. Jane died shortly after giving birth to Henry's only son, Edward. But Henry didn't mourn like a loving husband. Within days, he was already lining up new candidates for marriage. He waited 9 days after her funeral before starting negotiations. But the most disturbing part? Jane's labor lasted over 30 hours. It was long, brutal, and clearly dangerous. Yet the focus wasn't on her safety. There are accounts suggesting Henry gave orders to prioritize the baby's life over hers. Jane, in his mind, was a vessel. We're talking about meals so massive, so excessive, they'd be seen as mental illness today. By the end of his life, Henry was eating around 5,000 calories a day. That's more than double what an active man should eat. And Henry could barely walk. But it wasn't just the amount he ate that was shocking. It was how he turned eating into a full-blown ritual. Each meal was like a ceremony. Dinner meant an entire roasted pig, multiple chickens, fish, piles of bread, and enough wine too. Get 10 men drunk? His household kitchen made over 800 different dishes every day. Henry personally sampled dozens. His food staff was over 200 people, more than some restaurants have now. But it went beyond gluttony. Henry believed different foods had powerful magical effects that could improve his strength, grace, or even his love life. He was convinced that eating swan would make him more graceful, even though he needed help just to stand up. He thought deer meat made him a better hunter, though he couldn't ride anymore. Worst of all, he believed oysters boosted his sexual performance. So he gorged on them, thinking they helped, when in reality his body was decaying and his smell was unbearable. Every dish that reached Henry's table had to be tested for poison by multiple people. But his paranoia didn't stop there. After the tasters tried his food, he made them wait 30 minutes before he'd eat just to see. If they dropped dead from delayed poison, he also had sealed kitchens built. Armed guards stood watch as every ingredient was tested: salt, spices, water, everything. Making a meal for him became a military mission. Eating wasn't just eating, it was a stage performance. Henry sat and ate 4 hours while courtiers watched, smiled, and acted impressed by his appetite. Meanwhile, the stench from his rotting legs made some of them physically sick, but they had to sit there, pretending everything was normal. If anyone looked disgusted, it could be taken as an insult, and that was treason. So every meal turned into a twisted game of pretend, where no one could speak the truth. The king banned certain foods not because they were unhealthy, but because they were too common. Peas, barley, and turnips were forbidden at court. Those were the very foods that might have helped his health. But instead, he stuck to sugar, fat, and red meat. Tan got sicker by the day. And while Henry stuffed himself, much of England was hungry. Crop failures and food shortages hit the common people. While the king's kitchens devoured the country's resources, the royal kitchens took in so much meat, grain, and produce, they could have fed hundreds of families. But most of it went into Henry or into the trash. Even worse, he made major decisions while in the middle of these eating binges. Wars were declared, people were executed, treaties signed, all while he was too full or drunk to think straight. It was chaos. There are reports of Henry slurring his words, barely able to speak, while signing off on life and death decisions. The most grotesque part, his overeating made his body worse, which made him eat more to cope with the pain. It was a never-ending cycle. As the ulcers on his legs got worse, he ate to distract himself. As his movement declined, he ate out of boredom. Food became both his comfort and his curse. In his final years, Henry's meals were so extreme that some servants feared he might actually eat himself to death during a single sitting. He would eat until he vomited, then go right back to eating. His stomach had stretched so much that normal food portions left him feeling empty. The psychological part was maybe the darkest. Food became his escape, his one way to feel power in a life where everything else was falling apart. He couldn't stop his body from decaying, but he could demand a grand meal. He could make people watch as he ate like a god, even if he looked like a corpse. The waste from these feasts was enormous. Food that could have helped starving families was thrown out or fed to palace dogs. It wasn't just personal greed. It symbolized the massive inequality of Henry's court, where one man could feast while the rest of the country suffered. Even Henry's doctors couldn't speak up. Telling the king he was killing himself with food could be considered treason. So they stayed silent. They watched their patient eat himself to death, able to offer the most basic advice out of fear for their own lives. The same royal power that let Henry eat anything he wanted also made it impossible for anyone to stop him. It was like a disease one that spread across Henry VIII's entire kingdom, turning England into a surveillance state that would make modern dictators jealous. In his final years, Henry became so convinced that everyone was plotting against him, he transformed royal life into a psychological horror show. No one knew who to trust. Saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could literally get you killed. Let's start with something simple. Where Henry slept, he kept loaded crossbows next to his bed, multiple daggers under his pillow, and if that wasn't enough, he had armed guards stationed inside his bedroom, watching him while he slept. Think about that. He was so terrified of being assassinated, he couldn't close his eyes unless someone stood there, weapon in hand, just in case. But even that wasn't enough. Henry ordered those guards to rotate shifts every few hours because he believed that if they stayed too long, they'd start planning his murder. And to keep those guards in check, he had other guards watching them. It turned the royal bedchamber into something closer to a maximum security prison than a king's sanctuary. Under Henry's rule, the entire palace became a fortress of fear. He had secret passages built into every building he stayed in, not for romance or luxury, but so he could escape. It's unseen if assassins came for him. These were elaborate networks of hidden doors and corridors. It's designed so the king could move through his own home without being spotted by his staff. He even had peepholes installed in the walls, so he could spy on his own courtiers. And listening devices primitive, ones were hidden in meeting rooms to eavesdrop on conversations. It was crude by today's standards, but it worked. People never knew when the king might be watching or listening. That uncertainty created something far worse than fear. It created paranoia, and Henry didn't stop there. He created an entire network of spies whose job was to spy on his other spies. Informants reported on informants. Spies watched spies. No one knew who they could trust. Court life became a mental minefield, where even whispering the wrong word could mean a charge of treason. The most disturbing part? Henry's paranoia destroyed families. Children were encouraged to report on their own parents. Husbands and wives were rewarded for betraying each other. Servants were given bonuses for exposing their masters. Loyalty to the crown came first. Personal relationships came second, if at all. In Henry's world, trust wasn't just risky, it was dangerous. And when it came to food, things got even more absurd. He had multiple food tasters for every meal. His kitchens were completely sealed. Guards stood watch over the entire cooking process. Every ingredient was tested by different people, all supervised by armed security, were themselves watched by other security staff. A simple dinner became a military operation. Even the salt and water had to be tested. The plates and utensils had to be examined. One mistake, one slip-up, and the kitchen staff could be accused of poisoning the king and executed. Henry's paranoia wasn't limited to adults. He believed his own children might be plotting against him. He had Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth as daughters, watched by spies, monitored constantly, treated them like potential enemies inside their own home. Imagine growing up, knowing your father thought you were a threat to his life. The psychological damage shaped both Mary and Elizabeth, or ever. But maybe the most grotesque side of Henry's madness came out in his marriages. Each wife was subjected to psychological torture. Henry would test their loyalty with traps and schemes, sending fake reports to see how they'd react, or pretending to be ill just to judge their concern. Spies followed the queens everywhere, reporting every conversation, every gesture. These women weren't wives. They were prisoners living in fear, unable to confide in anyone without. Wondering if their words were being recorded and twisted, and then things escalated. Henry began executing people for crimes they hadn't even committed yet. Sometimes someone would be executed because Henry dreamed they had betrayed him, or because someone else suggested they might become disloyal in the future. The Tower of London became packed with people whose only crime was being too close to the king during one of his paranoid episodes. One of the most haunting examples is the case of the Marquis of Exeter, executed purely because Henry dreamed he was plotting against him. This was a man who had shown nothing but loyalty. But Henry's delusional interpretation of a dream sealed his fate. That dream turned death. Sentence sent a brutal message across the kingdom. Loyalty meant nothing. Innocence was irrelevant. The king felt fear, you could die, and fear spreads fast. Henry's paranoia infected the entire court. Nobles started spying on each other. Servants turned on masters. Everyone was looking over their shoulder, hoping they weren't next. People couldn't trust their friends, their families not, even their own staff. Every word, every glance, every silence had to be carefully measured. Anything could be twisted into treason. The saddest part? Henry's paranoia created the very disloyalty he feared. People who were once loyal became bitter and terrified. Those who may have had rebellious thoughts learned how to hide them better. The surveillance state didn't protect Henry. It isolated him. By the end of his reign,